Welcome back to Yahoo Finance's special live coverage of the World Economic Forum here in Davos, Switzerland. The mountains are lovely. The sun is beginning to set. There's a town here. There is a little town.
Oh, it's adorable. Yeah, it's teeming with people right now, about 3,000 of the world's richest, most powerful people.
Well, and
more than
big
that,
thinkers,
though.
right?
Right,
it's
absolutely.
not just for the wealthy, although it's often described as such, and not inaccurately, I might add. We have got a whole roster of amazing guests, and we're joined straight away by Niall Ferguson, who is the Hoover Institution Senior Fellow. Niall, so great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
I'm definitely not one of the super rich. I just want to make that clear to your viewers.
But I hope you're in the thinker category, perhaps.
I think that's why I'm here.
Right,
I'm doing my best to think.
And not like Elvis Presley necessarily, though. We talked about that earlier.
Well, I don't think I can think of a single resemblance between between me and Elvis Presley.
You're both outstanding.
Well,
How about that?
You're very sweet.
Now, let me ask you about President Trump. You heard him speak a little bit. What were your thoughts on his remarks?
Well, I rather relished the deadpan delivery. This was well-behaved Trump.
Yeah.
I also thought it was right that he emphasized the economic successes of his administration, which I think are significant, even if he was guilty of a little hyperbole, as is his wont. You have to remember that the last time I was here, which was in January 2016, almost nobody gave him a chance of winning the nomination, much less the presidency. And then the following year, they were all in a state of trauma because he'd won against their expectations, and they thought there was going to be a great disaster as a result. And they're all a great deal richer than they were back then. And it's partly due to President Trump. So he was, I think, entitled to take a little credit for that, even if he didn't exactly get a standing ovation.
Bit of a victory lap, right?
Yeah, do you think they're begrudgingly embracing him?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the dirty little secret of Davos 2020 is that they all need him to get re-elected. Nobody wants to say that out loud. But I think the consensus view is, A, that he will be re-elected, and B, phew, that's probably a good thing if the alternative is shudder Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren.
Is he the best candidate for the world economy? Is Donald Trump the best candidate right now?
Well, I think if Mike Bloomberg were listening in, he'd say, what about me? But it's still not clear that he really has a strong chance of getting the Democratic nomination. And if you take him out of of contention, then what are you left with? Joe Biden, who's not exactly been impressive on the campaign trail, and the current front runner in waiting, Bernie Sanders, who is a democratic socialist. I think if the markets even begin to suspect that Sanders has a shot, I think there will be significant volatility this spring. If Biden can hang on to it, then people will relax. But on the basis of past performance, I think most investors would say, yeah, please, can we have 4 more years of this? Because think of just one example. Donald Trump, who is certainly not renowned for his economic expertise, won an argument on monetary policy with the Federal Reserve, which you reminded us of today. If you go back a year, the Fed was just abandoning its plan to do quantitative tightening and to raise rates. So Trump won that argument and gave the world, through the Fed, easy money and kind of quantitative easing too, or quantitative easing in all but name, since the Fed stepped into the repo market. So that alone is a win that Trump has essentially shared with investors around the world.
But Niall, you said that Bernie Sanders actually has a shot here, and we talked earlier several months ago about populism and left-wing populism versus right-wing populism. So why do you think Sanders has a shot?
Well, if you just look at the polling, if you look at the fundraising, if you look at the strength of his ground game, he is a real contender here. And remember, there's a substantial proportion of Democratic activists, especially young ones, who feel that he was robbed of the nomination 4 years back, and that was a calamitous mistake. So I think people in markets are currently underestimating Bernie, and I think it's conceivable that if things play out in his favor in the early primaries, we'll get a sudden sort of shock awakening. Oh, my goodness, a progressive could do it. And all I'll say is that it is as unlikely seeming now in January 2020 that Bernie Sanders becomes president of the United States as it was unlikely in January 2016 that Donald Trump would be president of the United States. So if the consensus here is, oh, Bernie's nowhere, it's going to be Trump, you should probably bet against that consensus.
Right.
I want to talk quickly before we let you go about Britain. and you're pretty bullish on Brexit right now. What do the pessimists have wrong?
Well, I was a Remainer, but we lost, and I accepted defeat that same year, unlike some people
Big
I
of
can
you,
mention.
right. Yeah.
My attitude was, as with the sporting contest, the better team won. I was pretty dismayed by how poorly Theresa May conducted those negotiations, but we're in a whole different ballgame now. Not just because Boris Johnson's Prime Minister, he's certainly a more uplifting figure than Theresa May ever was, but he's also got some very important people on his team, and I'll mention just Dominic Cummings, his chief strategist, who was, after all, the architect of Leave's victory in 2016. He's been the architect of victory again in the election of December last year, and I think having Dom Cummings on the Johnson team as the negotiations continue with the Europeans, and we look towards what will be a very difficult negotiation on the future relationship, I expect the UK will do better in the coming year than it did in the 3 painful years of Theresa May's premiership. I also think that the UK economy, leave aside international sentiment, is going to pick up because a lot of investors were really holding back for fear of Jeremy Corbyn, for fear of a no-deal Brexit. Both those nightmare scenarios have gone. And so I think the downside risk in the UK has really largely dissipated, and I think the outlook's therefore pretty bright.
And you're concerned, though, about liberal democracy, just generally speaking, around the globe, right?
Well, liberal democracy is certainly not having a great run because populists to the right, populists to the left, to say nothing of the strongmen epitomised by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in the non-democracies. It's the liberal part that's frail. Democracy's in rude health. It's in rude health in, say, India. But Narendra Modi is not a liberal, and liberalism is the thing that's in some kind of retreat. I think that's partly because in our new social media-driven politics, the centre ground does not play well. And so I think liberalism has to rethink its appeal in the 21st century. It is losing the battle with those people who offer two much stronger brands. National conservatism, which I think is a good way of summing up the populism of the right, whether you're talking about Trump or Johnson or Modi. And to the left, this interesting new synthesis of socialism and environmentalism, personified by someone like Greta Thunberg, a young generation militant on the issue of the environment, but implicitly arguing for really large state interventions in the market economy. So it is, in fact, socialism by other means. Both of these ideologies are just more exciting, they're more galvanizing than dear old liberalism with its principles of individual freedom, individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience. I mean, those things are in retreat, even in places where you'd expect them to be in good health, like universities. I sometimes think when I look at the Western world's universities that free speech is more under threat there than it is in some authoritarian regimes. So I think that's where liberalism is struggling.
Well, lots more to continue to talk about. And do me a favor, visit us in New York, because it's going to be a busy year politically, and we'd love to talk to you again.
Thanks very much.
Niall Ferguson, Hoover Institution Senior Fellow, thank you.
Thank you.